I get confused with him all the time. It's all good. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I actually really don't know where to start other than I think we need to bring this back to why we're here in the first place. One of the things I'd like to mention is that the Honourable Leader of the Opposition has been an absolutely incredible advocate by the side of all of us on this side trying to bring this legislation forward. I couldn't have more gratitude for a person who has worked so hard alongside with us to bring this legislation forward and then to be attacked personally in this legislature for bringing forward questions that have ultimately led to this legislation, and then to have the government attack him for his good work in here, working with us and offering to work with the government. I think that shame needs to be turned back around onto the government, and you need to consider why we're here in the first place. One other thing that I'd like to address before I go fully into this amendment is the member who just spoke was talking about the reality of the people who commit these crimes and about the rights of them to be able to have a tribunal and all these kinds of things. Okay, but I'm going to tell you something, Madam Chair. My body, the bodies of anybody in this room, my children, my parents, anybody that I love, if a doctor ever hurt or molested or touched anybody that I know, and that person was not held accountable, and if government does not have the guts to stand up and say that that's not appropriate, shame on them. And on top of that, when we brought legislation forward to extend the ban on legislation that we're grateful for, I think all of us have said this here at least once. At least once, we are grateful for this legislation, no doubt. Whoever brought it forward. But to not extend that ban, and let me also say that the College of Physicians and Doctors, if you have consulted with them, would be grateful for the ability to be able to do their jobs properly that would have to be mandated by this government, and with the strengthening that we brought forward would give them all of the tools that they need to hold these people accountable who decide that in vulnerable situations they're allowed to massage breasts and pinch buttocks, and actually in Ontario molest 21 people that were sedated. Wow. 21 before it actually came forward. And he was banned for 10 years and was allowed to reapply, as far as I understand. Let's be clear about why we're here in the first place. This is a nonpartisan issue. This is something that we brought up with a very good intention of helping to change the legislation. This amendment is strong, it could be stronger. We have an absolute responsibility. And if you're telling me that a doctor who, and let me just quote, like I said, I don't even know where to start. Let me quote here from the hearing tribunal. Dr. Tahir did not suggest that he had any medical basis to touch his patient's buttocks or breasts. He admitted that. And then he went on to say, and I don't know, maybe he deserves more of a tribunal. We'll let the government decide that. But here we go. He had reported that at the time that he believed the patient's attire and behavior had been an indication that she had been giving him an invitation. Really? And the government wants to stop our ban on somebody like this from being able to reapply after 5 years because technically after 5 years they're not competent anymore, they have to reapply, it would be difficult for them. I'm sorry, I'm not going to weep over that. I'm weeping over the person that went there, trusted a doctor, and was manipulated by that doctor. Let's be clear about why we're here. The public confides in their physicians. The member had also said that the physicians are the ones that bear the burden of this, and they do. You don't think for one moment that physicians want to make sure that legislation is strong enough so that any young person that's coming in to this very, very noble profession understands right from the get-go that do no harm means that, do no harm. But But if we want to get into the weeds of what that means or that particular situation and make exceptions to the rule before we even get started, my goodness, are we not going 10 steps backwards? What is the purpose of this legislation? The purpose is to lay down a foundation to make sure that anyone that comes into this noble profession, and as it was pointed out to me, in education, if a teacher is fired for these particular reasons, they can't come back to school. Would you like to know that the teacher that's teaching your child, grandchild, cousin, friend, neighbor's child had, after 5 years, reapplied and then was allowed to teach young children again after having molested a child? We're talking about this legislation as it pertains to women, but what about children? What about vulnerable people? Anybody in a situation like that? Do any of you in this house want to stand in that doctor's office that has molested or behaved in any appropriate manner? Any of you? Any of you want to stand in that doctor's office, you tell me right now, who has proceeded with that, stand in that doctor's office, completely vulnerable in whatever situation you're in there for, and be okay because after 5 years they were allowed to apply, or they happen to have a mentor with them that watches over them, while you are shirt off, pants down, vulnerable.
I know this is an important subject for everybody in the House. Just a reminder, if you could do it through the chair, please.
Sorry, Chair. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Through you. I would like to know who in here would like to be in that doctor's office and is okay with that. Any of you? Sorry, Chair. I would like to know, Madam Chair, anybody in this House that's okay with that. And if you are, stand up now and say that that's okay. And that you're okay with 5 years, and that that's enough. That after that time that person has learned their lesson and they're not going to manipulate a vulnerable person while in their care because they didn't know what they were doing the first time around. It is an absolute honor to be here. Absolutely beyond my wildest dreams and expectations to be able to stand in this House with people who care about Alberta and protecting patients from sexual assault. And actually, this bill should be renamed an Act Against Predatory Doctors. This act is so important in promoting health. And we talk about women's health, but this is all people. All of us are vulnerable when we're in front of a doctor, all of us. We tell them stories about absolutely everything that is going on in our lives, absolutely everything. Things, Madam Chair, that you would not normally tell to even somebody you know that well because it's so personal. And you're going to that person with this information in your hand going, please help me and my situation. And the mistake that the government made in not accepting the legislation that we brought forward, hopefully, will be fixed in this amendment. And I'm grateful that they've taken actions to improve this important piece of legislation. The fear of sexual assault by a healthcare provider should never be a barrier. And for anybody who has ever been at the hands of a predator or sexual assault, the thought of going in, Madam Chair, to a doctor and being that vulnerable is already an issue. The experience of the member from Fort McMurray, Conklin, she talks about a gynecologist there that in Fort McMurray was charged with assaulting 6 female patients between 2003 and 2005, am I correct? Yeah. And it was very, very overwhelming, actually, to hear about, and especially if you consider rural areas. You know, we're considering people who, a lot of these doctors who live in rural areas, they know their patients, they know the families, they have dinners together. I'm very good friends with my doctor. And so that trust is even beyond just the doctor-patient relationship. But when we learned All of us were horrified to learn about the disturbing report that Dr. Tahir was about the sexual assault and about the patients that were twice assaulted and the nurse that had been allowed to return to work even though the doctor, Dr. Tahir, who was working there, had shown this bad pattern of behavior, and she had to go back and work with this guy. You know, so you can imagine, after fighting so hard to get this information across, we were very happy to see this legislation come forward. But I think what we need to consider in here, Madam Chair, altogether are the loopholes that are still there. And beyond the emotions that I personally have and have shown, and beyond the partisanship that has happened with the bill with respect to speaking about this, and beyond where credit goes or doesn't go, it's about we have to go to bat for the Albertans who put forward multiple and those amendments that we created on this side. This was because Albertans, their voice was in our ears through those amendments. Madam Chair, the amendments aren't for the people in this House. The amendments are for my neighbor next door that doesn't speak English very well, and she's an amazing woman. And they have 4 children. One of them has special needs, and she has to be able to go in to her doctor that she may not completely understand due to her limited English. And she comes from a country where things might not have been as wonderful as Canada is. And everybody is telling her, you know, we are this amazing country, these beautiful people, we are. So she already goes into that relationship with that doctor, Madam Chair, with the desire for trust. And so if we in this House can't uplift that public trust, we've lost already. This kind of legislation is there to actually invest in public trust, to invest in healthcare, to invest in what our expectations are. All of us who are in here, Madam Chair, as politicians, we're held to a higher standard. Why is that? That's a good thing. The expectation of our doctors should be no less than that. We rise to the occasion. We work harder. We learn from our mistakes. And if the actions of the government are only going to be chalked up to partisanship and not working together on this, I feel very, very sorry and incredibly disappointed. And I'm sure Albertans are as well. It's such a privilege to stand up in here for something that I'm so grateful for every day, and that's safety. And I want to thank the member from Calgary-McCall as well, too, because as a survivor, this is very, very difficult for her as well, too, and she's shown such grace and strength bringing forward legislation. And I wish that this had happened earlier this week when the bill was originally in 3rd reading. Late is better than never. And I want to thank the minister for being willing to take a step back and take a look at this legislation. And no one is perfect, as the leader of the opposition had said earlier, and we're not expected to be, but this is a very, very important step forward. 5 years after assaulting a patient is just not enough time, and I cannot imagine a single Albertan, and as you can tell by my speech this morning, would not be comfortable to be alone with a physician who had the ability to reapply for their license after a 5-year ban for being sexually inappropriate or aggressive with a patient. And consider, too, sexual assault, sexual inappropriateness, and all of these things are very, very broad spectrum definitions, Madam Chair. Broad spectrum definitions. And what we have to remember is that a doctor is a position of authority, no matter how you look at that. This is the person that has the information that is able to hopefully lead us. And what we're talking about here with this bill is actually about prevention. It's based on a very, very sad situation and the absolutely horrific treatment of people who went for care. But actually, the legislation is about prevention. The legislation is about setting up the right language, the right tone, and the right laws to be in place to make sure that the folks that are in this power position understand that privilege and understand the trust that is being given to them, and that they enter into that wholeheartedly understanding their responsibilities, and that is not something that any of us are willing to negotiate. Physicians who are convicted by a tribunal of their peers should never, ever be allowed to practice again. The credibility of our health system and the trust and safety of patients depends on this important change that actually we advocated for very hard on this side, Madam Chair. I am honored that I had the opportunity, and I would also like to thank my incredible, incredible staff that have worked so hard with myself and the Leader of the Opposition, bringing this information forward. It's been very, very emotional and very hard on everybody, and I'm very proud of the people that I work with. And I'm very pleased to have been able to bring this forward in the House and to see some resolution. And I'm so proud of my colleagues. I'm so proud of my colleagues on this side of this House who have fought so furiously to get this legislation to this point. Thank you.